Sameen Mohsin Ali is a assistant professor of international development at the University of Birmingham in the International Development Department. She was previously assistant professor of political science at the Mushtaq Girmani School of Humanities and Social Sciences at the Lahore University of Management Sciences, Pakistan. Her work has been published in World Development, Commonwealth, and Comparative Politics, and the Oral History Review, and she's co-editor of the textbook, The Politics of Development, published by Sage UK. Thank you so much for being with us. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to be here. I think when you first invited me, I was actually a little bit terrified, I guess, because I was like, oh, what should I say to all these amazing people who worked on this subject for such a long time? But I am actually really grateful for this invitation because you forced me to think about a lot of the different strands of my work and try to bring them into a coherent whole. Because sometimes people ask me, what is it that you do? And technically speaking, I'm actually a scholar of bureaucracies. So I work on the Pakistani bureaucracy. I'm interested in how bureaucrats and politicians work with each other or not work with each other. However, due to various circumstances, which are mostly me having been situated in Pakistan for some of my career, I've ended up working on all sorts of projects with computer scientists, with historians, with sociologists, and various creative arts professionals. And so I've tried to, in this talk, pull together a lot of those strands to try and give you a sense of what that work looks like and how I think about it. Hopefully you can see some slides. And so even the title of this talk kind of draws upon some of the different projects that I work on, especially the phrasing of just futures, which is from one of the projects that I will discuss. There's some illustrations in there, and I've put right up front who these illustrations are by and what they were funded by. And I'm very grateful to these artists' support because they've allowed us to visualize the things that we were working on, and you'll see these images as we go along. Before I get into what I do, let me just do my sales pitch. And I think this is originally why perhaps you found out about me through Portia, and this book is a labor of love by the department that I work in now, which is the International Development Department. So all of the editors are staff in the department, and the chapter authors are in some way affiliated with the department as well. So it was quite literally people sitting in the same corridor working together to write a book, which was a really interesting experience. And the other reason I think that this textbook was important is that it is directly informed by our students. So it was developed in sort of collaboration with them in the sense that it was through a course that was taught to them that the idea came about. And then the chapters went through a process of far more rigorous testing, perhaps, than peer review, because they were read by those students and critiqued by them, who gave us lots of thoughts about what they thought worked well, what didn't work well, what made sense to them, what they wanted in terms of design and visuals and so on. And we were very lucky to have a publisher that helped us bring our vision to fruition. So that was really nice. So that is my sales pitch, and I'm actually not going to talk about the book for the rest of the time that I have, though if you want to come back to it, we can. And the reason I'm not going to talk about it is very much a joint effort of which I was a very small part. So it feels a bit weird to talk about it on my own, but I'll talk instead about my own work. So I wanted to start by the strangeness of being situated in a development studies department. And my understanding is that in the US, perhaps development studies departments are not really a thing. And they don't exist in the same way as they do in the UK. And so I spent a lot of my first year or so when I started this job here in the UK thinking about what it meant to be someone who had come from a global South country to work in a development studies department. And I started doing some digging about the roots of the field and the roots also of the department that I was in. And so, of course, like Escobar is perhaps the most famous in terms of discussing sort of this idea of an intellectually deficient third world that had to be assisted by the first world in catching up. And the thing that I found most interesting in recent work, especially, was this idea of tutelage, which has persisted even beyond colonial or immediately post-colonial periods. And this idea that you can provide technical assistance, which is a huge part of my own work and the work of many of my colleagues, support with reform programs, support through various kinds of fiscal policies that aid you in tutoring, essentially, countries of the global south. And it was interesting to me to find out the history of the department that I worked in, which was set up very much by the government of the United Kingdom to provide that kind of tutelage and training to high-level administrators in countries, in different post-colonial countries, with the primary focus mainly being on the African continent and also in Southeast Asia. So there was a lot of sort of exchange of trainers going from here to train people, and students from these countries coming to the UK to be trained in how to administer their own countries. So initially, at least, some of the staff of the department was also former colonial civil service staff. And so that's where the roots of the department are. And it's evolved immensely since then. But even so, any critical mind will see that those threads continue to run through programming and practice in various ways. And even as we try and deal with it and contend with it, it is very much still there. So for me, the question then became, how do you think about, sort of doing projects, research, work, teaching in a setting like this, which has those kinds of roots, and many of them are still structurally not being acknowledged as much as one would like. Of course, there's decolonization as an idea, and it's, gained a lot of criticism in the last few years as something that is a trope, as something that is basically stripping post-colonial countries and those who live in them of their agency, and also as something that has become simply a word that people use to mean sort of inserting people of color into reading lists, and then you've done your duty to decolonization, and that's it. So there is this sense of, what does this word actually mean? Does it actually mean anything that brings about change? Or is it simply like a checkbox exercise that people indulge in to make sort of, meet whatever standards they need to meet as an institution or as actors in those institutions? So the approach that I found more appealing was an anti-colonial approach, and I found that more appealing because initially it was for a very simple reason, because I felt like decolonization seemed to require me to extract the colonial experience from whatever was going on and consider it separately, and to remove it from the situation that you were experiencing. Whereas I felt that it needed more than just extraction. I wanted there to be a more conflictual relationship between what was happening and how I was experiencing it. And so I found anti-colonial approaches to be more fitting, to be more appropriate. And I found some interesting literature that helped me understand where I was coming from in dealing with these situations. So for instance, thinking about power, the operation of power in projects, in teaching, in the classroom, amongst colleagues, amongst the day-to-day operations of a university, and thinking about what, how these situations are political projects that you engage in politically. And so for me, it's really important, whether in the classroom or anywhere else, to think about what is the power dynamic in these particular situations. And that has become something that's become a very fundamental question in my life. The other thing that I found really interesting is work by a scientist, Le Boiron, who has a lab of their own, and their lab is centered around an anti-colonial approach. And they set out 3 strands of that anti-colonial approach. The first is humility, second is accountability, and the third is collectivity. And even though these are sort of weighty terms, which are condensed into a 3-point framework, I found their engagement with these ideas really, really interesting, even though they're obviously coming from a very scientific and STEM lab situation. But I think when you design a lab environment, or when you think about how are you going to manage a lab environment, there are structural similarities to universities, to departments, to classrooms. And I think that there was a lot to learn from how they were thinking about these different characteristics. So I've tried to sort of think about these ideas in the operation of my projects, in the way that we do the work, and in the way that we think about who we involve in those processes. So bearing all of this in mind, bearing these ideas in mind, I started thinking about all of the different work that I've done over the last few years, and where I saw these features manifesting themselves in the decisions that we were making in our projects. So I'm going to talk through 4 different things, and for each one, I'll deal with a specific project or a specific engagement with a research team or outputs and so on, and evaluation as well. So I'm going to start by talking about project teams and partners. Then we'll discuss methods, outputs, and then finally evaluation. The evaluation one is the one that I'm still struggling with, so it's the sort of work in progress bit, as you will see as we go along. So first of all, talking about project partners, this has been a particularly enriching area for me in recent years because of a project that I've been working on, which is called EdJam. So you kind of see it in the image back there, and I'll talk a little bit about what EdJam is a little bit later. But suffice it to say for the moment that it was a large multi-country project in which we were engaging with lots of project teams that we had commissioned to work on education and transitional justice across the world. And what was really important for us in the project was to work with regional partners. And those could include students, it could include organizations, non-governmental organizations, creative art practices, studios, people who were documentary filmmakers, people who wanted to develop an app or who wanted to do something creative with the research that they had to hand. Young researchers were a special focus, so focusing on building the capabilities and the ideas of people who were new to the field, and also practitioners, so people who were not necessarily academics, who were not necessarily even teachers in a school setting, but who wanted to do public forms of history, who wanted to do public forms of engagement. And that was a priority for us in this project. And it was a process through which we as academics, based all over the world, not just in the UK, but in other parts of the country, of the world as well, we learned a great deal, because I think we come at a lot of projects from the lens of, okay, what is academically possible, and what do we need to do to make this a viable project or a viable product for academic research. And when you speak to practitioners and young people and students, they bring such a different perspective to these kinds of ideas that it's really refreshing, and it challenges you to think differently as well about your own research. The commissioning model of this project was really important as well, because it was not a model in which we were telling people in, say, Palestine or Cambodia that this is what we think you should do. It was the opposite. So the idea was that we would commission them to do the work that they thought was most appropriate in their own contexts. And in that sense, it was a unique project. It's not a funding model that is, typically allowed. And so we were able to do quite a lot of work that was prioritized by people on the ground in the countries that we were working with. So it saw a huge range of research and a huge range in terms of the output. So we had murals, we had artifacts in the sense of sort of knitted materials or crocheted materials being produced by students and by teams in different countries. We had apps, we had displays, some were traveling museums. We had films, documentary films, we had animated films produced. We had, different kinds of photography, different kinds of websites, all sorts, basically, that were bringing out creative ideas that were relevant in those contexts. The interdisciplinarity of the project was also really key, because we were working with all sorts of people from all sorts of backgrounds, all sorts of approaches, and there was no sense that you had to conform to our understanding of what research should look like or what outputs from that research should look like. And this is not, it wasn't an easy thing to balance out, because we were obviously constrained by the funding model that we were working in. And so there had to be a balance between, for instance, doing whatever you wanted and conforming to the reporting requirements that we had as holders of a grant. But it's worked out really well. And then one of the most rewarding things was seeing the cross-pollination across projects over time as well. And though this was a COVID era project, which seriously constrained our ability to meet people in person, there was still some opportunity towards the end of the project for meetings to be held between different teams from all over the world. So the photograph you see is from a meeting in Cambodia, and we hosted teams from all over the world. So people from Pakistan, people from Palestine, of course, Cambodia itself, from Uganda, from South Africa, Belgium, so all over the place, coming together and sort of discussing their ideas and sharing their research. It was also important to think about audiences. So who exactly is this research being produced for? It was not being produced primarily for a UK-based audience, and that was a really key sort of decision that was made by the people who were doing the research. So they were going to produce something that was responsive to the needs of their local audiences. And as I talk about outputs in just a bit, I'll explain what that means for the Pakistani context. Moving to methods and shifting gears to a different project. So this was oral history project that a colleague and I engaged in, again, over the COVID years, actually, which brought its own constraints and difficulties. And I'm happy to talk about that later. But the reason that oral history became something that really was very important to me in terms of shifting where power rests in these kinds of projects is that you're privileging the voices of those who are left out of official records or who are left out of discourse about official processes. And of course, oral history also exists about non-official processes, but my interest was in bureaucracy. So I was interested in who is getting left out of this conversation about who a bureaucrat is, what they do, what their purpose is in life, why do they become bureaucrats? So what are those stories, and how can we bring about those stories in a way that actually brings to the record those voices which are not recorded in, for example, historical records from the India office or from Pakistan state. So there were two other things that I felt oral history does. The first is that it counters the record. So in some senses, it was very much about, well, the state is saying this, but I have something else to say. And so it was very much a personal experience that went against whatever the state was claiming in terms of what the bureaucracy looked like in Pakistan. The second is the sort of bringing to the fore the things that get overlooked, and they get overlooked because this is an insignificant proportion of the population, or because nobody's interested in what they have to say, or because they have too little power to be influential, or because they're too small to be influential. And so it became really important to use oral history as a way to consider those pockets of the population which are overlooked in mainstream discussion about bureaucracies in Pakistan. So we did life history interviews, and it was nice to have really open-ended questions as a part of that, because we ended up asking very simple questions, like, for example, where did you go to school? Where did you go to university? What kind of education did your parents have? And initially, because I was new to oral history, whereas my colleague was more experienced with it, I was quite hesitant, because I thought initially that nobody would answer in sufficient detail for us to pick up, threads from it, or to draw things out. But actually, it was one of the most enriching experiences, because people would just start talking and start building on these stories, and you would end up with these hour-long interviews in which they had told things that they might not have told anyone else. And often at the end, you would have these we were speaking to women public servants, saying that, oh, maybe I have said too much, because it became this comfortable conversation about their lives, rather than what do you do for work, or what is your interaction like in the office. So these very, very sort of what is your life like kind of questions became really key to our project. What it also allowed us to do is, unlike an interview format, which I was more familiar with going into this work, it wasn't about what I thought was significant about these people's lives. It was about what they thought was significant. So the questions were open-ended enough for them to pick and choose what they thought was important over the course of their life. What were the key events? What were the key details? What were the key sort of moments in time where they were inspired, or they changed their minds, or they made a different decision than they might have done? And it was also very much about their inner life. And I found that, unlike when I had done sort of semi-structured interviews before, I did not really have to prompt those reflections. When you asked the life history interviews, it kind of just emerged as you went along, where they started talking about, this big thing happened in the world, and my thought about this was, or I responded to this in this way. So you didn't really even have to prompt them, because they connected those dots for you. And that was really fascinating to look at. And finally, what were the connections that these people were drawing between different things? So when we do semi-structured interviews, I found myself sort of drawing connections for people sometimes. So you ask questions like, okay, when this happened, how did this thing change for you? But in this case, that's not the question that we asked. We would just ask simple questions about, what was your training like? And because people had been telling us about their lives and how their lives had changed over time and evolved over time, they would make those connections for us. So they would themselves bring up, for example, oh, yes, my training took place during a time of political turmoil, or the military was in power, and that changed these things in different ways. And we did not have to ask as interviewers, what was happening with military rule, or what was happening with political turmoil. They brought it up themselves, and it was very interesting that those connections were drawn by the respondent themselves rather than us having to bring it up. So it was a really, really rich and rewarding experience to do this work. What was the project? Just to give you a sense. So this was a Women in Public Service in Pakistan Oral History Archive project. So we started in 2019, 2020, which obviously was maybe not the best time to start anything in hindsight. And this was when I was based at the Lahore University of Management Sciences, and Professor Sana Haroon, who's at UMass Boston and is a historian, was a visiting professor there. And we collected 65 interviews. We worked with some students who we trained to do oral history archiving as interviews and archiving as well. And that was also very rewarding because we could see how they moved from interviewing in this very sort of semi-structured instructive fashion to letting people talk to them. And so that was very rewarding from a teaching angle. The archive is available at the university library because of various ethical issues and constraints around the safety of these women. They are not accessible online. You can only go and access them if you're there in person. And that was a huge part of our work, trying to make sure that these women felt secure enough to talk to us about their work, because some were still in service, some had retired, and were very, very aware of their reputations and of the careers that they had built and the reputations that they had built over time. So they didn't want to didn't want to have a publicly available document that was, encompass the things that they had to say. We spoke to quite a mixture of officials. So some were elite officials, some were not elite at all. Some worked in, sort of fairly junior posts in the different departments. We have two publications out on this. One is by my colleague Sana, which is about the history of women's participation in elite civil service jobs. And then we have a sort of more methodological piece, which is about how we built the archive. And a considerable amount of that is what we did during COVID. So because obviously we had to move everything online. But it's been an incredibly rewarding project, and we're still sort of trying to figure out what to do next with it, because we finished the archiving now. And the thing that makes me think and reflect on oral history quite a bit now is that even though we've written these two papers, it's only now that I'm going back and coding word for word each of these interviews in line with a sort of a feminist institutional lens that I'm working on for a project. And it's been absolutely fascinating to sort of think through how these women see themselves as women public servants, how they perceive their role, how they perceive their identities, and what they see as their motivation for doing this work. So obviously there's the typical, I wanted to do good. I wanted to make a difference. I wanted to improve things in life. And then you see over time, as they're telling you about their life, how that changes and shifts, and also becomes tempered by the realities of being in office, of the realities of living in a society that is deeply, deeply patriarchal, where they are hugely constrained by expectations around marriage and childbearing, and so on. And you see that in some of the illustrations, like this one, in which there's this perpetual concern about, where are my children? Are they well taken care of? Can I bring them to work? Can I not bring them to work? And because this is a deeply patriarchal society, it is not the norm to sort of bring your kid to work, or have those kinds of support systems in place which allow women to work. And so it's been really fascinating to look at these outputs. What it also allowed was this discussion or exploration of an intersection of political and non-political. So how is something that is regarded as not being political, like the family, and these women themselves associate this as non-political, right? So they have a very clear division between this is public and this is private. And I might disagree, but for them, this was a very clear divide, that the way that they behaved in their offices is not necessarily the way that they will behave in their homes, or with their in-laws or with their husbands. And it's absolutely fascinating to trace how they, because some of the questions were personal, how do they differentiate those two spheres of their life, or how do they consider those two things as overlapping or interweaving with each other? The coding that I'm doing now is really iterative. So I go back and forth in terms of how I think about the coding, or what kinds of things I'm coding. And it kind of keeps growing at the moment, which is maybe not helpful in terms of getting it done. But it's focused on thinking about how these women perceive of rules and norms around their work and around their jobs. And many of them will refer to, and in Pakistan, this is very standard, where people will say things like, in Urdu, the phrase is "Aapko to pata hi hoga," meaning you must know this already because it is the way that things are. These are the rules and the norms that we are expected to conform with, and how we have either navigated that or not navigated it. Motivations, interests, incentives, inspiration, and aspiration are all key things that keep coming up again and again in these women's conversation. So why did they join? Why did they make those decisions? Why did they take this exam? Why did they join this department? Why did they choose to send their kid to live with their parents miles away from them where they were working? Or why did they give up this kind of job? Those kinds of decision making is really key to these women's lives. And feelings, thoughts, opinions, perceptions about their careers, about their jobs, about events, political events. And the interesting thing is that if you went and you asked these women in their offices, what did you think about this political event or this, the military taking over, they would never tell you. But because they were telling you in a life history interview, it just kind of, you didn't even have to ask, it just emerged that, well, during this time, there was this political upheaval or the military took over, and this made life difficult in these ways. And so it was a very personalized account of a very, very public event. And I found that really fascinating in reading through these interviews. The image you see, the illustration you see here is one of the things that I did based on these interviews was to ask an artist to help me develop a choose your own adventure game. So we basically developed illustrations which presented sort of the choices that these women come up against throughout their careers. And this was online for a little bit. It's the website is down now while I figure out what to do next with it. But this illustration is from one of those choose your own adventure pages. Moving on to outputs, and here I'm going to go back to EdJam and the which is the Education, Justice, and Memory Network. And this image is from visual minutes that we took during an event about teaching and understanding violent colonial pasts. I mentioned this earlier, but there's always this tussle between what we are supposed to produce as academics, so journal articles, chapters, books, and those that have meaning in the context where we work. So for most of the population in Pakistan, they don't have access to journal articles, they don't have access to the kinds of books that we're publishing, and they certainly don't want to read them for the most part. So how do we make our outputs accessible, interesting, relevant to the folks that we want to speak to? The visual minutes are a nice, handy way of doing it. They are obviously in English, which is not helpful in a country which, like in Pakistan, not a lot of people speak English. And so translation obviously is a key detail, but equally, how do you produce outputs which are grounded in the context about which they are, basically, and how do you differentiate between research outputs and pedagogical outputs? So we thought a lot about what we should do and how we should produce work for issues around education and transitional justice. And we did that in collaboration with our partners in the different countries. And so this was not a process of us saying, this is what we think you should do. We think you should make a documentary. We think you should make an animated film. This was about the partners or the projects that we were funding coming and telling us that we think that this is the best way to do this. This is the best way to convey the ideas that we want to convey. There's lots of them. And this gives a little bit more detail about, skip that, about EdJam. And there's a little website link if anyone wants to check it out. So we work in 13 countries. Pakistan, Uganda, Cambodia, Colombia, which I've misspelled here, Jordan, Argentina, Democratic Republic of Congo, Mexico, Peru, Jamaica, South Africa, Palestine, and the UK. And it's been immensely rewarding to see the different ways that people have dealt with issues around education, transitional justice, and all of these contexts. It's also a very collaborative network and across disciplines because we work with heritage sector professionals, we work with academics from different departments, people in civil society, researchers, activists. And one of the big questions, for example, for us in working on the project was, how are we differentiating activism from our work on the project? And it became like a very interesting debate that a lot of us engaged in. EdJam was funded by a UK Research and Innovation grant. It just ended March 2025. So the nice thing is that you can go and look at all of the outputs on the website, which includes documentary films and things. And I think almost everything is publicly accessible, barring a few things which are taken down either for ethical reasons, ethical constraints, or things like safety, participant safety, stuff like that. The project was structured around 4 themes, and it was. The first one was transitional justice and memory. There was history education and classrooms, heritage education in everyday lives, and finally learning, collaboration, evaluation, and partnership. And I was involved in history education and learning, collaborative evaluation, and partnership. And our work is basically trying to straddle all of these different countries that we were working with. And I'll come back to this in a little bit. What did we do in Pakistan? So there were 2 things that we were concerned with. The first was the teaching of history in Pakistan. So Pakistan is I mean, for folks who are maybe not very familiar with the politics of the country, so this is a country that has had multiple periods of military rule, and historically has tried to construct a sense of nationhood by emphasizing a national identity that is not shared by most people in the country, and a linguistic identity that is not shared by most people in the country. So a lot of the history that is taught in state schools is essentially the state version of history, which sort of says that we won all sorts of wars and we're amazing and we've been Pakistan has been around forever, which it hasn't. And so a lot of it is dismissive or non-inclusive in the sense that it doesn't account for minority communities and their contributions to history. It doesn't present a honest account of events in history, especially around the military's role. And so a lot of what we wanted to do was to think about how history is taught in classrooms and how we might influence that. We did not start by thinking that we might be able to change the way that the state was teaching history, or that we would be able to change the state curriculum. That was not something that we aspired to, because it wasn't really achievable. So we had to think of something else in terms of how do you influence people's understanding of Pakistan's past and its future. And so public history became one of the ways that we started to think about this. How do you make publicly accessible materials that anyone can have access to, which do not need to be taught in a school, but which parents might access, students might access. And so we ended up doing 2 primary projects. The first one is called Shahri Pakistan, and the organization is Shahri Pakistan. It's called Hashia. The project is called Hashia, and you can see like the text on the left-hand side spells out Hashia. Hashia in Urdu is sort of marginalia or footnotes. That's what the word means. And we also had a series of children's books, which we developed in collaboration with some students, and I'll show you each of these in a bit. So Shahri Pakistan is a social initiative that seeks to make accessible civic education. You might recognize the image on the screen. So one of the things that they started doing was taking decolonial thinkers' work, such as Frantz Fanon, and translating it into Urdu and making it available in sort of these bite-sized images for things like Instagram, Facebook, and also producing material for YouTube. And there's a huge market for this because a lot of young Pakistanis and Pakistan's youth population is very large. So many of them are on the internet, many of them are wanting to learn more. So these little snippets were available for people not just to read, but also to engage with. So there was an encouragement to comment, and the team would then sort of respond and sometimes get into a debate with people about these ideas. And they did that with a whole series. So this one is about Orientalism. So there's a translation and sort of a discussion about what it means, what the term means, where it comes from, and so on and so forth. So there's a whole visual dictionary. It's in Urdu, a dictionary is called a Logat, which is available on their Instagram page, which basically traces out all of these different ideas and discusses how they might be applied in the Pakistani context. So that was one sort of public output that they produced. The other public output, I don't know if you'll have time for, but so I'll come back to in the end, but just to sort of give you a sense of what it is that this is a link to an animated video, and there are a series of animated videos. Some of them are about colonial events. So this one is about Jallianwala Bagh, which was a massacre in 1919 by British forces in Amritsar, in what is now India. These are hand-drawn animations, and they draw on research on events, either, sort of in the colonial period or in Pakistan's history, sort of providing a critical account of historical events, and also across all of the different videos that were produced, tracing forms of violence across colonial period and Pakistan's history, and drawing linkages between how colonial violence took place and how violence is taking place, is being reproduced by the Pakistani state today. So the videos are very much sort of drawing those connections between colonial and post-colonial violence. And the idea is to push people, Pakistanis, to think about those connections and to think about how the state operates in ways that are quite similar, actually, to colonial rule. There's a few of them, and I can share the link. There's Imperial Peace. There's also one about collaborators of the British Empire, which is about how did locals from the subcontinent work with the British in terms of perpetuating colonial power. There's one on 1950s Pakistan, which is about a crackdown on a minority group, which has, sort of led to essentially their exile from the country. And there's a few others. Some are unfortunately embargoed because they're a bit too sensitive to put out there. But if anyone is interested, we can talk about that later. The Pakistan Children series is a little different because it's a bit lighter. They're meant for a younger audience. And what we did was that we worked with undergraduate students and we asked them to think about what stories they wanted to tell, which they had not had when they were in school. So when they went to school, what were the things that they felt were underrepresented? So some chose to talk about the climate, some chose to talk about animal rights, some chose to talk about what it was like to be an expat who had come back to Pakistan. Some chose to talk about poets and literary figures. Some wanted to talk about mythical figures or mythical historical figures from the part of Pakistan that they were from. Some wanted to talk about underrepresented groups and their contribution to Pakistani society. So we worked with these students. So they developed the storylines, they did the research, and then we paired them with a local illustrator to produce the images for these books. And so all of these images are by local artists. These books have taken on a life of their own, which we were not expecting, because they have been read and used at events in New Zealand, in South Korea, in the UK, in Canada, and elsewhere. And it's been absolutely fascinating to see how people have responded to them. And we get emails and messages saying that, oh, we found these online, and it's been so interesting to see something like this come out of Pakistan. And of course, it's because our students were able to think about what they found was lacking in discussions about Pakistan and use that to develop these outputs. And it's been really interesting to see the way that the books are used in different contexts. So we did a small print run to begin with, which ran out very, very quickly. And so my colleague who's based in Pakistan now is doing another print run, and we're hoping to get it out to more schools and libraries for free, of course, because it's funded through the project. So how do you evaluate a project like EdJam, where you're basically commissioning people to do the work that they think is important in their own contexts? It seemed wrong, and even for the oral history project, it seems wrong to say, how many people did you reach, or how many interviews what is the numerical value of your research? And that's not what we wanted to do, but we were part of a learning, evaluation, and partnership strand of the EdJam project. So we had to think about something that we could gain in terms of evaluation terms around, from these very, very different projects, very, very different contexts. So what we ended up doing, and we're still working on a little bit, is that EdJam is premised on the values that you see on the screen in front of you. And the idea was that these values would inform the kind of projects that we would do, that we would fund, the work that we did, and would underpin our interactions with our different project partners as well. And so we thought that, okay, so maybe we will develop an evaluative framework that is based on these values. So that's what we've been doing over the last year or so, where we're trying to come up with a values framework for thinking about how do you evaluate projects in terms of their generosity, dialogue, reflexivity, sustainability, creativity, and so on and so forth. It's not the easiest task because we also are very conscious that we don't want to judge them as such and say, oh, you haven't been creative enough or something like that. So we're trying to think really carefully about how do you take a values approach to doing this kind of monitoring and evaluation. So rather than asking projects for, how much footfall did you have or how many eyeballs looked at your videos, we've been speaking to them to try and understand what the process of the project was like. So when they did the work and they shared the outputs with the audiences that they had in mind, what did they think about that process? What did they think about what went into the exercise of the project? How did they design it? What were their interactions like with us as the core team? What did they think about in terms of, what could have been done better or done differently? And using those reflections to think about the project as a whole as well. So what could we have done differently as a core team to further enable these kinds of values in the work that we were doing? So I'm going to stop here, and hopefully I'm either on time or under time. But I would really welcome questions about any of this. I know it's a bit of a crash course in a lot of different projects, so I'm very happy to unpick any of them or to talk about my other work as you like. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Prof. Ali, for a really fascinating discussion. Over to you, Prof. Makoni.
Okay, thank you very much for this fascinating conversation. I want to start off from the least exciting question, and then we can move on. In the development studies department, do you only study context outside the UK, or do you also study development context within the UK? Geographically, do you have any projects in which you are studying development within the United Kingdom, or this is just more of that the focus is always in you focus outside the United Kingdom?
It's a really interesting question. I think in general, the literature in this area and the teaching in this area has been that we're dealing with developing countries. So
Okay.
we're trying to teach them to develop. So even when I joined, I was handed a course to teach. And when I looked at the learning outcomes, it was a course on reform. And the learning outcome said, we're going to focus on developing countries. And I took exception to that because I was like, no, it's not that the global south is the only countries that need reform. Everybody needs reform. And we should know that, having gone through Brexit and so on in the UK. So I think things are changing, but slowly. And I think a lot of times when the UK is used, it's used as, well, this went well, and so why couldn't so-and-so do something similar? And that's what a lot of the literature in public administration development looks at, which is sort of, the UK did this to its public administration system, and why couldn't country X or Y do that? And I think the more critical of us will teach students and say, look, we tried that way of doing things where it was like a recipe, where you take the recipe that the UK did and you just reproduce the recipe and the cake will be just fine. And it's never just fine. So so if you're critical in development studies, that's the stuff that you're teaching students. But I think it would be, I would be putting really rose-colored glasses to say that, that's the norm in development studies in the UK. It's not. It is still very much around, this is the right way to do things, and this is not the right way to do things, which is, to my mind, it's not the right way to teach it, but yeah.
Then my next question is, who are the students that you currently teach in your course? And where eventually do they get jobs? Do you have students, let's say, from so-called developing countries who come to attend these courses, or this is largely a group of students from the UK who you teach, and then they subsequently go and work outside the United Kingdom, but are funded by the British government?
So there's a larger UK higher education picture here, which is that there's very little funding for international students. So most international students who are coming and studying for, let's say, an undergraduate or a master's or even a PhD are unlikely to be funded. So it's quite a small pool that gets funding.
Okay.
Most undergraduates will be UK students. So that tends to be the trend, that very few people can afford to come to the UK for an undergraduate degree because it's 3 years, very costly. However, most master students tend to be international students, and that has the landscape has changed a lot in recent years, where increasingly, because UK higher education is receiving less and less funding from the government, and because home students, UK students, are paying less and less fees, the pressure is to extract as much money as possible from international students. So they pay very, very high fees and have for a very long time. And universities in the UK are dependent on that income to the extent that, every move that Trump is making in the tariff uh, wars has consequences for the UK higher education sector, because it depends how many Chinese students are going to be able to come to study here and are going to pay the fees. So these are political economy factors in UK higher education are really, really key right now, because that is most of our market. A lot of Chinese students come to the UK to study subjects like public administration, for example. Um, it used to be a little bit different. So we used to get quite a lot of students in the UK um, from all over Africa, Nigeria, Uganda, Ghana. And we used to get a lot of South Asians. For a lot of people from India, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Pakistan. And at one point, especially in the early years of my department, a lot of the people who used to come in and do public administration degrees were people who had civil servant jobs in newly independent, 1950s, 1960s, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, India. And the idea being that, they will be trained as administrators in the UK. So the landscape has changed very, very significantly in recent years. And in fact, if you read anything about the UK higher education landscape right now, there's massive redundancies. It's a really difficult environment. And development studies as a field, as you can imagine, with the decimation of US aid, and cuts to aid spending in the UK as well, is increasingly precarious. And I think one way of handling that precarity, it's not a solution, but I think, is to be more critical of the origins of development studies, right? So if we keep following this model that, yes, the UK is doing everything right and we should follow it, I think that's not going to get us very far, because increasingly students can also see that it's not working. So I think that sort of critical approach is valuable, even from the demand from students. To your question about where do they go and do jobs, so some of them return because they already have a civil servant job, so they'll go back and do those. Um, a lot of the Chinese students that we get want to join the Chinese civil service, or want to have those kinds of jobs, or sort of civil servant adjacent jobs, so advising the government in some way, things like that. So those are the kinds of jobs that people want. And of course, if they're doing development studies, they want to go into the development sector. So whether it's working for something like UNICEF or the World Bank or the government itself, so variants of that.
Okay, then I think two more questions after that I hand over to Chanel. Are there development studies departments in Europe as well, or development studies departments are an idiosyncratic species peculiar to the UK? Who are your counterparts in Norway, France, Germany?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Um, there are some. There is sort of UNU Wider, which is the UN's sort of like a university that they run, I think, or is linked to the UN in some way. Um, they do have some interest in development studies. There are some departments, but as a field, I think the UK sort of dominates it, because they're quite a number and quite well known. And if you believe in university rankings, then the UK ones top those rankings. And I mean, there's a long history as well. So I did my PhD at SOAS, and SOAS was founded to educate colonial administrators. So that legacy is very much there, and has continued in post-colonial eras. And SOAS has actually done something really interesting, which did a decolonization project, which unpacked its past. So it used to be online, actually, their exploration investigation of SOAS's colonial history. I don't know if it still is, but they did this really fascinating project on it. And it's something that I think every university should do in the UK, which is like try and unpack, where they're coming from, where did the money come from, and so on and so forth. So for some universities, obviously they found associations to slave owners who funded their libraries or funded their buildings. Some acknowledge it, some have huge battles over acknowledging that kind of funding. So it's really contested history. And in Europe, I think there seems to my mind, I think Europe has a little more focus on area studies than in development studies. So they tend to be a bit more sort of Asian studies or African studies, and development is still, it's there, but I think relatively less so than in the UK.
Okay, let me ask the last question, then I'll hand over to Shania. I liked your discussion about how, for example, you have translations of some of the work by Frantz Fanon into Urdu, etc., that sort of direction. But my question is the exact opposite. Are there any, in your project, did you have any material in which you were translating, let's say, work by philosophers who write in Urdu into English? Or the translation was largely like the one that you gave us, Frantz Fanon, and the material is then translated into Urdu? What I'm asking is, I'm asking two questions in actual fact. The reverse from Urdu into English, one, and then two, translations of work by philosophers who may be writing in different languages in Pakistan into other languages in Pakistan.
It's a really excellent question. In this project, we didn't do translations in the other direction. So there weren't translations of work that is produced locally into English. One reason for that was that the audience was Pakistanis. So, the idea was to make it accessible locally. So to be fair to our partners, that their aim was different. But this is something, both questions that you've asked are actually something that we had a conversation about at a workshop I attended last year, it was called the Pakistan History Workshop. And it brought together historians who work on Pakistan from various parts of the world. And one of the issues that came up was exactly this, that while we are prioritizing sort of translations of work in English to Urdu, and a lot of historians who work on Pakistan produce in English, either because they have jobs in universities in the UK or in the US or wherever, or because they work in private sector universities in Pakistan, which is where a lot of the work that is recognized globally is produced, and it's all produced in English. So we had this conversation about sort of prioritizing the translation of work that is produced locally in local languages, not just in Urdu, because Urdu is just for most people in Pakistan is the imposed national language. But work that is produced in Sindhi or Punjabi or Balochi and so on, so that be translated into more portable languages. The other thing that some colleagues are doing, historians based at the Lahore University of Management Sciences are doing, is that they have sort of prioritized engagement with local. They're not academics, I wouldn't say. I think they're more, I guess public historians is the appropriate word. So these are people who are sort of self-taught, and especially around things like city life or languages and literature that is local to the region. They produce work that is not accounted for in the English Academy. So these colleagues are increasingly working with them to sort of give that work greater prominence. So there's a center at the university in Lahore called the Gurmani Center for Languages and Literature. And they do quite a bit of work on this now. So trying to foreground work that is produced in Punjabi and Urdu and so on and so forth. And not just academic work, but literary work as well. So it's I think becoming an increasing priority to move away from an English-centric model.
Okay, thanks a lot. I think that's as far as I want to go. Let me hand over to Chanel.
Thanks, Prof. Okay, so Tebogo just made a statement, so I'll just read it out to you and perhaps you would like to comment on it. He says that some historians assert that history is written by the victors. Like now, our history is being written by the sitting government in all aspects of our lives. Just in case you wanted to perhaps comment on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if I think those of us who've lived in those kinds of countries, you open a textbook and you're like, well, I know this is not true, but the book says it. And one of the things I used to do, and was a really eye-opening moment for me, is that there was a specific military dictator in Pakistan who decided that it would be compulsory for all school and university students to study and pass an exam on something called Pakistan Studies. Now, so we all had to do it. So I did it at school level and then at university level, and my students had to as well. And I was very lucky as a student, as a high school student, to have a very critical teacher who I remember came to class one day and said, "What if the founder of Pakistan was wrong, and that we shouldn't have done this?" And it was just, I mean, I still remember being 14 or 15 and being absolutely horrified that this teacher had said that in my class, because it was not done. It was just not the kind of idea that you expressed in a classroom. But I am so grateful to him. His name was Shams, and if he's, by some coincidence seeing this somewhere, he was just an amazing teacher. And I've, sort of every few months I will think about him, because it really made me think critically about everything that I read about Pakistani history and politics. And then fast forward a few years, I was teaching Pakistan studies at university level to undergraduates. And I remember we were talking about sort of the wars that Pakistan had engaged in with India, and the outcomes of those wars and so on. And a student, there was sort of pin drop silence in the class, and the class ended. And at the end, this young woman comes up to me and she says, "But how can you say that we lost those wars? My textbooks told me that we won." And I was like, "Okay, but I want you to go to the library, look up some books and read on this, because that's not true. The textbooks they're not, that's not what happened." And so it's genuinely this moment of where the victors have very, very definitely written that history, but you have to start pushing back on it, right? And eventually, you'll change one mind, maybe you'll change five minds, but eventually that critical mass grows and grows and grows, and you build up that sort of muscle to ask those kinds of critical questions in different settings, I think.
May I ask, in terms of I know at the at the school level, obviously the state is very involved in education. Is there a lot more academic freedom than in the university space in Pakistan?
No, no, there isn't. Well, I mean, yes and no. There are some topics on which it is not possible to hold conferences, for example. So you cannot, there was an attempt to hold a conference on the creation of Bangladesh a few years ago when I was still working at the university in Pakistan. And um, it was shut down. Like, we got a phone call saying, if you don't, then, there will be consequences, essentially. And so the whole thing had to be shut down, even though there were, guests who were supposed to be coming from abroad and so on. So there are certain topics which are absolutely off limits. And there are risks to speaking up about these things if you're in Pakistan. So there are sort of, like, there are certain risks that we take as people who work on these kinds of situations, on these kinds of contexts. And I mean, at some point you arrive at the point where you're like, I'm going to say what I'm going to say, and what can you do? So if you're in a private university, there's a little bit more flexibility, perhaps, because you are slightly more insulated, and your curriculum isn't coming directly from the state. So for instance, when I taught a class, it was my decision what papers were on my reading list and so on and so forth. But you are still in a society that is very, very regulated. So that, it's always in the back of your mind.
Thanks so much for that. Okay, so Sibusiso Cliff Langamandla asks, can you say more about how your project made use of outputs in journals, books, and non-academic outputs within the communities, and how you decolonized yourselves from academia to participate in a multiple alternative outputs?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So the project itself, so as far as sort of the oral history project was concerned, has been interesting because we published based on the work that we had, and the archive exists. We have had meetings with some of the women who participated who wanted to be involved in further conversations about, we've got this sort of critical mass of people who are interested in these issues, what can we do with it? But I found that it stalls because they're too busy, or they're too caught up in the everyday of their lives to sort of push through changes. Some did sort of feel empowered to challenge certain practices in their departments and things like that. And it was not because of me, but I think it was because of the conversations that they had initiated amongst themselves over a period of time. And especially as younger people have gone into the civil service, it's changed a little bit. But on EdgeJam, it's been really interesting because most of our outputs are not academic. So some of the projects did produce their own outputs. So for instance, some of our Latin American projects have produced outputs in Spanish. But otherwise, most of the outputs are actually not academic at all. So there's been a chapter here or there, which is produced by the core team, but it's mostly been about sort of the approach that we've taken. Most of the other outputs are actually sort of creative art kind of output. So websites, posters, murals, some are in public spaces and we're designed that way. So some in sort of public park or something like that. There's apps. So Cambodia, for instance, the Cambodia partners that we had, they developed an app to raise awareness of practices and events during the genocide. And so that's the tool that they thought was most appropriate to share their findings, share their research. In Uganda, there's a traveling museum, and again, to cover incidents of violence. So they've taken it all over the country to try and display the materials that they have and the records and research that they have. And the idea being to initiate conversations in order to prevent further violence, future violence. We also work with the Uganda National Museum to try and figure out the best way to represent violent pasts in a way that is sort of, not traumatizing or re-traumatizing to people. There's also, I believe it's on the EdgeJam website, and it's by a colleague, Professor Okaka, who works in Uganda, and he's produced a documentary on the sort of musical and vocal practices that communities have used to try and retain their memories of violent pasts, right? And how they've tried to contend with traumatic memories. So you can watch that video, and most of this stuff is online actually on the website, so you can go and check out all of these outputs. How have we decolonized ourselves from academia? I don't think we have, to be very honest with you. I think we try. And, I think it's a very piecemeal kind of process, because ultimately you get caught up in, how do I get promoted, or how do I get, whatever increment, or how do I meet whatever requirement I need to. So in the UK, we have this thing called the Research Excellence Framework, which is that all of our published work is evaluated, and then the universities in the country are sort of scored on that basis and get money awarded on that basis. And it's such a structural constraint, right? Because my producing a website or my producing a documentary counts for nothing in that framework, but my producing a journal article does count. So, you're very, very constrained by that. So I actually don't think I've managed to decolonize myself at all. And in producing even this textbook, this is not a referable output. So it doesn't get the university anything. It's nice, and it's good for the students, but there are values that are attached to these things that I think it's very difficult for us to separate ourselves from. But I think, personally speaking, I think how rewarding it has been to see things like the videos and the children's series that we did, the kind of response you get to that is better than for any journal article. Nobody writes to me and says, "Oh, I read your journal article, how amazing." Nobody does that. Or that I read it out in some event in New Zealand or in South Korea. Nobody does that with my academic work. So from that perspective, it is so hugely rewarding.
Thank you. Ashraf.
Thank you very much, Sameen, for your presentation. I've got around 3 points of questions. The first question is about the way of representing the violent past. And this is one of your key aims. Teach or to convey to people how to represent the violent past. My question is about the three words, the way, and the second word, representation, and the past. How do you do that? First thing, I mean, whose way? Whose way? And if it's your way, what about the past? It's not your past. And the notion of violence itself. Have you experienced that violence so that you can articulate it in the way of those people? And the second question is about the difference between decolonization and de-Westernization. I got confused because you rejected decolonization, because you said it denies agency to people, although you cited somehow the translation, which is one of the output for your project, the translation of Fanon. Fanon is a decolonialist, somehow. So are we talking about, just de-Westernizing in Pakistan, for example, the knowledge or the center of the control of knowledge, for example? And the third question about solidarity, how can you establish solidarity with the people outside those local contexts, like people in Palestine? And this would lead me to the politics of naming. How do you name, for example, what's going on, the violence, the forms of violence, which are going on, for example, in other parts of the world, like Palestine? How do you name it? And the third question also has to do with the politics of translation. You rightly said you're tussling between outputs that are valued by the academy and those that are, have meaning in the context which those studies or research, actually, that research was done. Do you think, to what extent is the way violence is represented in the academic discourse correspond to the way violence is expressed or articulated in local discourse? Thank you.
Thank you. Let me start with your last question on violence. I think the way that we talk about violence in terms of academic research is probably very, maybe desensitized is the word, because we're obviously writing for a particular kind of academic audience, and we feel like we need to sort of wrap it up in certain kinds of languages, whereas if you talk about it in local context, then it becomes a much more visceral kind of discussion about violence. So I think that those of our partners who are working or in presently very difficult circumstances or historically very difficult circumstances have a very different experience of discussing violence and of understanding violence and of writing about violence than for example, I would sitting in the UK, which is why I'm not the one doing it, right? So they're doing it because they're the ones in those contexts. They're the ones who understand what past and present or future violence might look like. So the idea is not for me sitting here to tell them how they should discuss violence in their countries or past violence, present or otherwise. And so I think that the project's merit was in precisely letting people figure out what that meant for them in their own contexts. So if, for example, if it's Cambodia and they want to talk about the genocide, and they want to talk about what that means for young people in Cambodia right now, today, that was a decision for them to decide how they wanted to do that. We were not telling them how to do it. So they came up with the idea, they came up with, what they wanted to say, what they wanted the app to look like. And many of them have many years of experience of working with sort of museums or archivists that work in this area. So we were not the ones telling them how to do it. To your first question about the way that we talk about violence or represent it, so to speak, and what we consider the past. This was not a decision that we made for this project. So how people choose to engage with their audiences about what happened in the past or what might be happening in the present was a decision for them. So if they wanted to do it using written outputs, then they chose to do that. If they wanted to do it by producing some kind of craft, like working with young people to produce some kind of output as they, sort of thought through the violent nature that brought that kind of craft to them, that was their decision to make. It was also their decision whether they wanted to do it with relation to past violence or present violence or some combination of the two. So in the Pakistani context, it was interesting because when we originally started working with our partners in Pakistan, their idea was the original idea was to talk about and develop animated films around colonial violence. It was only as they started doing the research and working on it, it's not because we said it, it's because their thinking evolved and they started seeing the similarities between what had happened in the past as they did that research and what was happening in contemporary Pakistan. By contemporary Pakistan, I mean post-independence Pakistan. So the 50s, 60s, 70s, and up to the present day. Now, how they chose to represent that visually was their decision. So we were not involved in those kinds of decisions. We simply, we were involved as mentors. So we went in and said, okay, maybe the sound isn't great here, or this image isn't conveying what you think it might be conveying. So we gave them that kind of feedback, but it was just feedback. It wasn't like, oh, you should do this. So those were decisions that were being made by teams in those countries. So similarly for the Palestine case, so I was the mentor for the Palestine project. And the reason that I didn't talk about it in this presentation is because precisely it's not my experience. I don't feel equipped to talk about it. My opinion is that what's happening in Palestine is a genocide. That's my opinion. You can mute me if mute that out or cut that out if you think that shouldn't go on YouTube. But that is what is happening. And I was working with a team that was based in Palestine. So I have a very real understanding of what that experience is like, but it's not my experience, and I cannot speak to that experience. Similarly, for our projects that were based on the African continent, I did not include them in this presentation because they're not my experiences. With Pakistan, I have substantial personal experience, and so I feel in a much better place to be able to discuss those projects. And so that's why the project website, and I can put it in the chat in just a little bit as well, is there so you can explore those projects yourself because they're emerging from people who are based in those countries. Decolonization versus de-Westernization. I think that, yeah, Fanon, it would probably not have subscribed to anti-colonial ideas or anything like that. But I think it's important for people to, and again, it wasn't my output and I don't mean to claim it, but our partners feel, and I support them in that it's important to have an understanding of this work to be able to develop your own ideas about what you think is appropriate for your practice. So if you don't know Fanon's work, then your thinking is not as informed as it might be about these issues. If you have access to it in a language that you're more comfortable with, then it helps you sort of think through your own ideas and maybe evolve beyond it if you want to. If you don't want to, that's fine too. So I think de-Westernization, I think there is a drive to move towards more South-to-South collaborations. So I think there are parts of Pakistani academia, for example, which are looking increasingly towards local collaborations, and especially with places like Sri Lanka, with which there have been sort of partnerships and things. The problem, obviously, for the region of South Asia is that we can't go to India, and India can rarely come to us. I am not allowed into India. I can't do research in India. So it's not possible for me to deal with the country that is the closest in terms of research interests. So it is very difficult for us to collaborate with India. So you have to find other spaces. So the thing that would have allowed for de-Westernization or moving away at least from Western modes of knowledge and modes of production would have been to have sort of this region work together. That is not possible because of geopolitics, et cetera, which I won't get into here, which means that the reliance on Western spaces increases. And I found it really interesting that half of EdJam is based out of projects in Latin America. And that has an ecosystem of its own. And that is because Latin American countries have their own setup educationally. They have their own language. They publish in Spanish, they write in Spanish, they speak in Spanish. And so some of our colleagues, some of the core team also spoke Spanish. And so they had a whole other relationship with them that those of us who did not speak Spanish never had, because we can only communicate with them in English. So, you know, you need a translator otherwise. So all of our events used to have live translation and stuff, but it's not the easiest way to communicate. But the Latin American model of locally produced knowledge is, I think, very is a really important one for the South Asian context. And I don't know enough about the African context, but I think probably also for the African context in terms of developing sort of a hub of knowledge within the region that isn't reliant on Western funding, first of all, and also Western modes of production. I think I've hopefully answered all your questions.
Yeah, you have. Thank you so much. It's a quick follow-up question. Mr. Coco has raised his hand. The notion of abstraction, one of the reasons that, that led you to avoid using decoloniality or decolonization is it extracts some items and names them as colonial, as you said. Yasmin, you used one of the strategies or platforms or space in which you refer to consistently is the notion of the archive. We know the archive is one of the most effective colonial strategies, So how did you rework the notion of the archive? How did you rescue the notion of the archive from that colonial connotation?
I don't think we did. I do think, like, I mean, in situating the archive in the country, which the research is about, we did, in the sense that it's not in, a British archive, it's not in an American archive, even though the two co-authors work in. So my colleagues, Professor Haroon works in the US, I work in the UK. The archive is not accessible in either of those countries. And so the archive is only available in Pakistan. But we haven't been able to, I mean, I don't think it was our mission really to sort of break down the concept of the archive in any way. I think it was very much our objective was different, because it was about sort of privileging these women's voices. And this is very much a category, and it's not the only category which gets overlooked, but is a category that gets overlooked in work on public administration bureaucracies in Pakistan. And especially because we were doing this work in an environment where there was immense backlash against women's participation in public life in Pakistan. So the harassment of women journalists, the trolling of public figures, women in public life on social media, in public, women politicians. And there's actually a project about this based in Sussex, which is about the backlash against women's movements. If you're familiar with the Pakistani context, there was for many years, there's been a very public women's march, which has been stoned. It has been banned. It's received a lot of backlash. And so this project was very much emerging in that environment. I don't think our ambition was at all to dismantle the archive. There's a worthy project, which I know other people are doing, and it would not be my place to do that, because it's not what I do. But I think there's a lot of interesting work and increasingly critical work on the archive, and I think that it's helpful when you have people who at least understand the context in which they are working, producing the archive, rather than someone coming from outside and producing it. So I think that does make a difference. And it was helpful that I was working in Pakistan at the time that we started this project. I think my hesitation now in continuing this work is hugely based on the fact that I am no longer based in Pakistan, and I no longer feel comfortable doing this project when I'm not situated there myself. And this is a long-standing discomfort I have across all of my work. So I work on political issues. I have a huge discomfort about speaking about political events in Pakistan on the fly when I don't live there anymore. So that it makes a huge difference to my ability to do my job and to do the research that I do. So increasingly, I tend to shift away from that kind of work, actually.
Okay. Okay, thanks so much. Okay, so there are two questions that I think touches on Ashraf's question on politics of translation, and then also picking up perhaps from something that Prof. Marconi mentioned earlier from Cecile. Okay, so Michael Scott asks, first thanks you, and then asks about EDGAM. How does the project incorporate or build upon the linguistic diversity of Pakistan or the other countries involved? In the case of Pakistan, it has been said that Pakistan is not a country, but rather a treaty between four countries. So how does EDGAM accommodate the social linguistic diglossia, which impacts the status of the official idioms of English and Urdu, and decolonial discussions in the local languages of the different regions, peoples of Pakistan? Yeah.
Thank you. Really great question. For a lot of our outputs, we have produced local language versions, so Sindhi, Saraiki, so on and so forth. It's been difficult because it's not that people don't speak these languages. You can even find translators. That's not the problem. The problem is that producing online text that represents these languages is quite difficult because they're, they don't have that kind of, like, I don't know, whoever does, the typing for those languages, it's not possible to do it. So from a accessibility angle, it's been very difficult. So even though we have translations of the children's series, of the videos and outputs, that exists in local languages, and we do make those available, but putting them online is much more difficult. The other thing that is complicated in terms of, and Iqbal Ahmed was absolutely right, who you quote here, is that accessibility and it's also just fear, to be honest, I think, and rightly so, because there are parts of the country which are so heavily regulated and heavily policed that things that are possible in places like Punjab, which is the most prosperous province, are not possible in a place like Balochistan. And especially by people like me who are from Punjab and who it would not feel right to me to go and tell people in Balochistan, this is how you should run your life. So I think that there are disjunctures there which are far more fundamental than the language issue. We have done outreach. So, I mean, there's a few different things that we've tried to do. One is to make the books accessible. So where we have contacts, and my colleague who's based in Pakistan, she has contacts, I have contacts. We've shared the books in those local languages with different parts of the country. We've also shared, sent a version of the textbook to a university in other parts of the country for their libraries. So that kind of accessibility we can make possible. But there are huge constraints around what the extent to which people can engage with critical ideas. And I think that is a choice for them to make and not one for us to impose. So yeah, absolutely. It's something that we do try and do in terms of translations, but there are sort of various difficulties that we have run into on the way.
And
Okay.
then, thanks, Michael Scott. Okay, Cecile asks if you thanks you also for your presentation, and asks whether you can expand on your choice of a anti-colonial framework over a decolonial one. What is the conversation around these issues in Pakistan?
This is a really interesting question. And I'll tell you, the first time I heard conversation about this in Pakistan was when I finished my PhD and started a job in Pakistan. They asked me to produce a teaching philosophy statement. And when I asked around about what quite was expected of me, I was told to write about decolonization because it was the thing to talk about at that time. This is a few years ago, this is a few years before COVID. I think that there was, the way that, these ideas travel from the Western academy, they travel to Pakistan as well. So, there's this idea of, do we have diverse reading lists? Do we have Pakistanis on our reading lists? Are we sort of only talking about Western authors or Western ideas? So that awareness was very much there in the pre-COVID years. The anti-colonial framework is actually something that I got into because when I came to the UK, even though I had quite a few years of experience teaching high school and university level, I had like 6 years of undergraduate teaching experience, I was still expected to go through a full teaching qualification to teach in the UK. So I had to do a master's level degree. And as part of that, they asked me to do 3 assignments. So the first assignment was a teaching philosophy statement. The second assignment was like a personal reflection on your career trajectory. And the third one had to be an analytical piece on some aspect of your practice. So I chose to analyze my department's offering, the courses I taught on, using an anti-colonial lens. And so for me, it was really like I started thinking about it from a decolonial lens, and I didn't like it very much because I thought that it didn't give me enough to work with in terms of power structures for the kind of space that I was in. And that's why I chose anti-coloniality. And the rest of the piece that I wrote was about how that kind of tutelage model is reproducing itself in present day programming in the department, even while we are saying we are decolonizing, we believe in equity, diversity, and belonging, et cetera, et cetera. So that's what the piece was about. And it was I will say it was a very critical piece, and so it has not seen the light of day, even though I think I sent it to my head of department, but beyond that, it's not written, it's not published or anything anywhere. But that's why I arrived at the anti-colonial framework, and I actually found it really interesting that and because I was working on EdJam and the values framework for evaluating it at the time, I think Liboiron's approach to managing a lab, I found really, really interesting because she talked about it in terms of how she dealt with the everyday through an anti-colonial lens. And for me, that was what really spoke to me at that time.
Cecile, don't know if you wanted to do a follow-up perhaps.
No, but I would love you to expand on that. What you say that for you, the decolonial framework was too restrictive. Can you elaborate on why is it too restrictive in your context?
So a few reasons. One is it was being used a lot without meaning anything in my immediate context by people around me, right? They would just say, oh yes, we're decolonizing this, and what does it mean to decolonize? But they didn't actually do anything. And
who did you read? Sorry for interrupting you, but who were you in conversation with about this decoloniality framework?
When I was writing the assignment, I'm talking about people at the university I'm at. So I was, like with colleagues, I was invited to an event where some students had invited me to speak about decolonization and higher education, even though this was not something I had ever written about. And I think, there was a sense of, am I being invited to this because I'm a brown person on staff? So I thought about it a lot, like, I'm at this event in which we're talking about decolonizing higher education, and I'm one of the few people who's actually saying anything which is critical. And so I felt very out of place. And because I'd gone in and said things like, well, how can you decolonize something when structurally there's so much wrong with it, right? So I'm talking about sort of everything from how recruitment works at the university all the way through to how we recruit students and so on and so forth. And I by the end of that event, I felt like I was sort of sticking out like a sore thumb because I'd said too much maybe. And I was like, someone is going to report me and I'm going to lose my job. And so that's when I started sort of exploring this a little more. And because the conversation around decolonization at that time in my workplace was very much that, well, we should diversify reading lists and we should have more stuff that looks different. So, very sort of very nice in checkbox ways, but none of it was actually challenging power structures. So I felt like there was this thing about, taking like if you read the word decolonial, for me it was like, okay, you subtract it from the situation and then things are okay, right? So you remove the coloniality and you somehow manage to extract it completely, and then you can move on with your life and everything is okay. And I felt that no, first we have to have this battle before we can do anything else, right? So first we have to fight it out and say, okay, what are the consequences of colonial practices? What does that actually mean structurally, institutionally? Once we've fought that battle and once we've done that sort of push and pull about where power is resting, then we can talk about anything else. So for me, it was that the clash that anti-colonial approaches promise, right? That the explicitly political nature of those debates, rather than just very sugary words that indicate that, we like you, we want you here, but we don't want to change anything to make it so that this system or the structure works for you. So that's where my thinking on this was coming from. And this is not, I mean, this was before I did that assignment. I had not really engaged with these ideas in any huge amount of depth. I mean, I'd read Fanon, I'd read a lot of these people as an undergrad and as a postgrad, but most of my work was on sort of something else, and so I honestly never thought I would engage with those ideas beyond that. And somehow the circumstances I was in made it essential for me to do so. And I was genuinely very surprised by that. That is not something I had expected to do, to be honest. I didn't even expect to write that assignment that way. And when I had written it, they asked me if I wanted to publish it or if I wanted to put it on like a university system. And I said, no, you can't, because it's so heavily critical of the way things are done that I cannot afford for you to publish it. So, so it's very much a very personal experience in that sense.
No, because some of us would argue that what you didn't find in your decoloniality, reflection on university actually has been there about structural issues and stuff like that. So that's why I was asking you, who were you in conversation with in the kind of scholarship you were reading? Because everything is there, actually. What you seem not to find in the decoloniality literature is actually there. So that's why, and it's not just about changing, putting Pakistani, African, or Indian names on the list of on a reference list in an article or on the syllabus. It's not about that, and we long argue that it's more than that, and we actually address the structural, the extractive nature of coloniality and what it implies and all the structure of the university. So it's there. So that's why I was wondering,
No, absolutely. I mean, I don't doubt that at all. And which is why,
Okay.
I mean, it's, I'm by no means claiming that I've,
No,
done,
I was just,
I've
I
read
was
on it, but
interested.
not very much.
Yeah.
But like I said, because I think it was very much, like I said, a very personal experience of being in a situation where
Yeah, I
the term
understand
was
that.
being used in certain ways,
Right.
and the literature
Yeah.
is, vast, and I also soon realized I couldn't do justice to it. But for the space that I was in at the time, I think it was also the anti-colonial framing also offered a far more combative
Okay.
approach. And
Okay.
for me, that was personally important at that time. And the reason
Yeah.
I'm hedging a bit is because it is a very personal experience, right? And it's not necessarily
Yeah.
something that I don't write about this academically, and this very deliberate choice.
Okay.
And I think there are people who are better equipped to do that. But for me, it was very important to go in and say something that was I need you to think about this as me pushing back in visibly, verbally. And that's something that I've tried to do since then. And I mean, again, as someone who continues to be in a very precarious situation in my job, I'm here on a visa. If I lose my job, I have to leave the country. So there are sort of very serious consequences to the kinds of
Yeah.
decisions that I make on a day-to-day
Oh,
basis.
yeah. Yeah.
So it gets hugely complicated because of that. And so someone has asked in the chat if my resistance has been appropriated by Western universities. Yeah, I think it is, and it's a very deeply uncomfortable situation to be in, where especially when you've been recruited from a global South country, and you've come here and you work in the kind of department, sort of an international development department, and the word decolonization gets thrown around a lot, and you become deeply familiar, obviously, over time with the kind of practices that universities engage in while they talk about these things. And so for me, I found solace, maybe, in the anti-colonial framing. Like I found it far more representative of the way that I was seeing the world. But yeah, but like I said, this is not my area of expertise at all. But it's something that I have become familiar with through practice, I guess.
No, but I think you express it very well when you talk about your own vulnerability and how also you are instrumentalized, because it's very much part of the, you know, of the problem.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Prof. Ali. It was really wonderful. Lastly, I want to give the floor to Salikoko, and he will end off the discussion for us.
Thank you. This has been very stimulating intellectually. You may have seen me on and off because I had connectivity issues here with my computer. Cecile asked her question just when I was about to ask the same kind of question. Because when you started your presentation, I went on Google and checked the difference between decolonial and anti or anti-decolonial. And I noticed that they are not mutually exclusive, by the way, and it's a matter of preference. And neither of them claims more agency on the part of, say, the marginalized or oppressed populations than the other. And also, for that matter, the people that are anti-colonial are not exclusively people that have been oppressed. Anti-colonial movements have often involved people that have benefited from colonialism. And in the decolonial enterprise, I think that a lot of people that are engaged in this program are from the global south. And they may be the majority now, although the most prominent names and leaders happen to be people from the global north. But that is about how things are constructed and how knowledge has been spreading and who is citing whom and who is promoting whom. Then you get in that complex thing when you in the anti-colonial framework may be paying more attention to what is the proportion of people from the global south that are participating in this, whereas a person working engaged in the decolonial paradigm is doing it in the way that I interpret it in the way that Derrida coined the term deconstruction, that you extricate things and you reassemble them in new ways, knowing what you have to leave out because it is inadequate and what you have to bring in. And that is where the input from the global south becomes more significant. And in some cases, in the way I interpret that, it's a matter of establishing a dialogue between the received doctrine and an alternative interpretation of things, seeking for what is more adequate. So, but I just wanted to add that. But Cecile asked a question so brilliantly that I won't take more time of the audience about that. One thing I want to acknowledge, and from one of the questions that Marconi asked about the direction of translation, is that I just realized the translation process in knowledge so far, at least in colonies and former colonies, has been a colonial enterprise in itself, because the emphasis has been on transmitting knowledge from the colonizers for the colonized people, but getting little from the colonized people into, for the education of the colonizers. Or when that knowledge was constructed, it was constructed, wait a minute, yes. is a mediated interpretation of indigenous knowledge by the outsider. And the outsider's construction of that knowledge can be transmitted back to the indigenous people. And when it comes in translation, again, you can imagine how much of it may be lost in translation in both directions. So I'm glad Makoni asked that question, because he had thought, oh, yes, why have I never thought of this before? Because, you know, it just fits in the paradigm, and I can see why, for instance, it is relevant to be able to translate, say, some work done by the natives from native knowledge or the native languages into the colonial languages, and from one native language to another native language in the spirit of diversity, so that people can understand. And guess what struck me also as very interesting is that, like here in this forum, we are communicating in an imperial language. Things could have been different, but we don't make an effort to change that particular kind of situation. Maybe it's a situation that we cannot change at all, but it's something that we have to realize, that there is a lot of coloniality continuing in the process of our own engagement in the decolonial or anti-colonial endeavors. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I absolutely agree with you that there are a lot of similarities in approaches. And I think I said to some student asked me once that, you know, how do you understand decolonization? And I said that I understand it as challenging power structures everywhere. And for me, that was what was important. And I found that to be, I don't know, maybe linguistically better expressed by anti-colonialism than decolonialism, or certainly in a context, as Shanella said, where decolonization had come to mean something very different, has come to mean something very different. It's interesting what you said about sort of, you know, our privilege, and so I because someone talked about Iqbal Ahmed and Pakistan's dynamics. My family migrated from India, so we were amongst the privileged, so to speak, in Pakistan's history. So that is also something that very much informs my engagement with local languages and so on, none of which I can speak. I can speak English and I can speak Urdu and I can understand some Punjabi because I have lived in Punjab for most of my life. But, you know, there are that awareness is very much there, that I am, you know, sort of in Pakistan, my family would be regarded as what is known as muhajir, i.e. migrant. So you migrated to Pakistan at partition. The other thing, because you mentioned the colonial sort of collaborations, is my family benefited from colonial rule. That is something I have, you know, when I was young, I had no sort of way to understand that. But as I've grown older, as I've read a bit more about it, you know, come to realize that a few generations back, my family was, at least in part, collaborating with the British Empire and engaged with the state in, you know, through employment, etc. And, you know, for the first time, I realized I was genuinely like, oh my God, this is shocking and this is wrong. And then I was like, you know, of course, I can't ascribe wrongness to it. I didn't know those people. It's 2-3 generations ago. But I'm also very aware of my present privilege. Because of that background, I am in a position where I got an English language education in a country where only a tiny fraction gets it. I went to private school, I went to private university. And yes, I could say, you know, I was a scholarship student or I worked hard or whatever it was. But the fact is that I'm immensely privileged. And so I think that's also why the sort of the challenging power bit spoke to me quite a lot, and the way that Ajam chose to do things, where I was not telling people how they should talk about their experiences was very important to me, because it's something that you become very aware of over time once you start digging through your own history. Like, you know, what are the spaces that you can speak in, and what are the things that you can speak about. And it's been, I mean, someday I hope I have the time and the energy to write about what it's been like moving from teaching in Pakistan to teaching here, because like it's been really, like, it's been a fascinating exercise personally. And I don't have the right framework to think about it yet, but maybe in a few years I will. And it's a really interesting sort of shift, and a very interesting structural dynamic that I now find myself in. And it's yeah, maybe someday. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Prof. Ali, for a really wonderful discussion. We really appreciate your time and just sharing your experiences with us. It's really, really, thank you so much for that. Makoni, I'm not sure if you wanted to say something in closing. You are muted.
See, nothing except to thank Professor Ali and to let you know now we're transitioning to what we call the after party. You won't be the person having to answer any questions. If you have got questions for us, you can ask us, and we